Hello, welcome to my screencast for Android test-driven development. My name is Jovce, and in this video I'm gonna demonstrate the way I perform my daily work. For this exercise, I will apply the so-called outside-in test-driven development, also known as London style TDD. Of course, you can Google about that and find out more on the internet. And for this exercise, I also assume that you're familiar with the architecture components of Android as well as the mocking libraries such as Mockito. For this exercise in particular, I chose a very simple problem, which is going to be a login feature, which has the following three requirements. So it has to handle a successful login result, it has to handle the failure login result, and it should not perform login for provided invalid credentials. I have created already a very a basic project here, and the way we're gonna do this is that first I'm gonna start with acceptance test and then work towards the internals. So that's why it's called outside in. So we start from the outside world, working towards the internals. Therefore, I'm gonna start with an acceptance test for this feature, and then I will dig into the little details. Let's see how that's gonna go. Here I have my package. I'm gonna create a new one. I'm gonna call it login. Oops, sorry. And I'm gonna start off by a class where I'm gonna write my acceptance test. So let's see. Let's start off with a test. I'll name it perform login. And let's think about this thing. So normally we want to offload all of the as much of the code as possible from the UI. So basically we want to make our screens, we want to write as little as possible code in our screens. This is not only in Android or the mobile platforms, it's only on web. So basically you don't want queries in your HTML. And in that sense, Google came up with the architecture components which are quite helpful in here. We're going to use the MVVM architecture, and we're gonna, I'm thinking about implementing a view model where I'm gonna kick off my login process and work on some collaborators there, such as some sort of a repository that's gonna perform the login for me, and then I'll just delegate or push the results towards my UI, and the UI just gonna observe some sort of live data. So in that sense, I would expect here, I'm gonna start with a verification. I'm gonna introduce some sort of login login result observer, or login live data observer. And then I would expect a change to be called with the login results. Let's make this compile. I have a typo. It should be verified, so I can import the verify. Let's create this one. It's going to be a property. So this is going to be our observer, which is of type observer that we can find in the architecture components library. And it's going to be of type, let's say, login result. and then this is going to be a mock, and therefore this class is gonna be run by Mockito JUnit runner. Let's make this compile. Okay, it cannot be a file, it should be init variable. Oops. And what is the login result? Login result is actually the signal that we are going to be sending towards the UI. And I would expect this to be some sort of sealed class, which is going to have different types of signal. So in the UI, I'm going to be able to switch over that. Let's generate this class. I'm going to extract it into a new class, new file. I would put that into a data package in my source. Here it is. I'll move it on the right side. I'll close the left panel, so it's gonna be easier to see what we're doing. I'm gonna make this bigger. So as we said, this is gonna be a sealed class, and yeah, that'd be it for now. Then the login results is going to be also a property. I'm gonna make it. It's gonna be a fol. I'm gonna directly assign login result dot success, let's say. So thinking about a login, after a login, on successful login, I would expect some sort of user in return from the web service. So I would pass something like this into the success. So let's create this one as well. It's gonna be a user. Let's assume the user has username and full name and about. For now, I think that's gonna be fine. Let's create this class, also extract to separate file, and I'm gonna also put this one into data, move it on the other side, make it bigger. So here I have a username. It's gonna be a value. This one also is gonna be value full name, and this one is gonna be about. I would expect this class to be data class. I'll reformat and user name. Yeah, I think that's fine. We'll get back to our login results. So let's create our success. It's gonna live inside the login result. This is gonna be just user. This is also gonna be a data class, and I would I have to extend from the login result, and this has to be val in order to compile. Exactly. So here it is, and I think that's quite a lot of code that we generated so far. And the beauty of the outside-in test-driven development is that we make a lot of design decisions during the red phase of the TDD. So the red phase means like the cycles of the TDD are red, green, refactor. And right now we're in the red phase, and we are generating a lot of code. So the thing is that this is one of the differences when comparing the outside-in with the classicist approach. Okay, let's get back to our test. I would not, thinking about Android, when we are kicking any sort of asynchronous operation, we're showing for the good UX, we are showing the user that something is going on. So basically here I would also expect the login live data observer to be called with some sort of enable loading So it's gonna kick off some sort of spinner, and after the fact, after the operation is done, I would expect to be called with disable loading. So these are also going to be login result types, and I'm just gonna assign right away I'll just represent it with one type and just pass there Boolean value, which will say whether it has to start show loading or not. So it's sort of a flag. I'm gonna create it inside here. It's gonna be value type Boolean. It's gonna extend from the login result, and I would also expect this to be a data class, something like this. All right, and then basically I'll duplicate this. I'll make this disable loading, and it's gonna be false. So yeah, this is what I would expect. And in order to get this observer called, I need to perform some sort of, I need to trigger something in order to get this being called. So as I am imagining, I would have some sort of a login view model, which will expose a function where I'm gonna pass my login credentials, something like this. Let's go on and create all of this. I'm gonna create a property. It's gonna be my login view model. It doesn't exist for now. I'm gonna create this class, and I think it's gonna live in this, just the root login. I'm gonna move on the right side, make it a bit bigger. That's it. Then I need some login credentials. I'm also gonna make a property out of it. And I'm gonna directly assign, and I would assume that the login credentials could be something like username and password, let's say. I'm gonna create this class. I would put this also in the data package. I'll move it on the other side, make it bigger. So on the right side, basically I have the code, on the left side I have the tests. I prefer that sort of split, so I can see what I'm doing better. Here I would have some username, and I'm gonna have just username and password, and this one also deserves to be a data class. So I think that's fine. Back to our view model, I think we have to extend from the view model, something like that. And here we have to generate a member function. And yeah, that's it. So we came up with a view model that exposes a login function. For now, we have no implementation inside. And in order for this, in order for the observer, let's make this a little bit, yeah. So yeah, in order for the observer to be called, we have to actually assign the observer. We have to set it to observe to something. So what I'm thinking of, it's gonna be expose some sort of live data from the login view model. Login live data, and then I'm gonna observe forever with my login live data observer on it. right? And then I kick the login and I expect these things to happen. This function doesn't exist right now. Let's make it. It's gonna expose a live data of type login result, right? And by making it live data, we are exposing immutable live data, so nobody from the outside world can change this, can do changes to the live data. And internally here, I'm gonna create sort of property that's gonna be a mutable live data, also login result, and then just import this, and I would return the login live data here, right? There we go. And yeah, so this looks more or less fine. What happens if I run this? Right, it says this exception is that because we're using the architecture components, we need instant task execution rule. So it's gonna work. Right, and then okay, let's get back to our test and run it. Right, we're having this one is not implemented. This one actually throws exception. Let's run. It should fail for the right reason at this moment, this test. Right, so we wanted the live data to be called, but it didn't. So that's actually the reason we want this test to fail for at this moment. But I think this test is not quite complete actually. I don't want this observer to be called randomly with these events. I want those to be in order. So I'm just gonna go ahead and define an in order construct around the login observer. Just import this, and I would expect these guys to be called in order, right? Yeah. Now I think I'm happy with my acceptance test. I would expect that this test will evolve over time. Let's see how that's gonna go. But for now, I'm pretty satisfied with it. Let's jump on to the login view model and let's start unit testing this one. I like to add a should suffix to my unit test classes because when I'm the reason is that when I'm reading, I'm gonna move it on the other side. When I'm reading the test, I prefer my test to start with a verb. So instead of starting my test with should, I know that this class is a test, so I don't need explicitly to say it's going to be login view model test. But I want better. I like it better when I see what this should do, and I don't like when each test starts with should do something. I know, so I prefer starting with a verb. Let's start off with a test. And what we would like to test in the view model is the login function, right? So this view model should perform login. Pretty fine. Okay, so are we gonna, so thinking about it, does it make sense to do all that logic about the login inside here, or it makes more sense to delegate it to some other collaborator? So as we spoke in the introduction, I would expect that job to be offloaded to some sort of repository, which is gonna be doing that. regardless, when we are having a view model, regardless if we are doing a database query or if we are doing service call or whatever, we are actually having those components separated from the view model, and they're only being collaborators in the view model itself. So here, when I call a login, I would expect some sort of another collaborator to be called. So just this login will just delegate that call. In that sense, I'm gonna start also with verification, and I would verify that some sort of login repository was being called with my, okay, let's name them just credentials, with my credentials. Let's make this compile. I'm gonna import this. What is the login repository? Let's create a property, and because this is collaborator, I'm gonna just mock it, and it has to be late init var in order to be a mock, and I will need Mockito runner. So this is going to be a login repository, right? And this doesn't exist at this moment. So if I was doing this in Java, most probably I would have created a class for the login repository right away. But since this is Kotlin, I cannot easily mock classes because the classes are final by default. So I'm going to go ahead and create an interface and then create some sort of implementation for the interface. That's actually a good thing, in my opinion, because it allows us to not depend on actual implementation, but rather on abstraction. So I'm going to go ahead and create an interface. I would assume that it would live in the login package, right? I'll move it on the right side, make it a bit bigger, right? And yes, what are the credentials? The credentials gonna be a property, which is going to be a login credentials. I'm directly going to assign the login credentials, some user and some pass, let's say. That's pretty fine so far. And then let's go ahead and create this function. So it will take login credentials, no implementation here because it's an interface. And that's pretty much it for now. So I would assume this one to be called when I call, yeah, let's get sort of back to our view model. When I call login view model dot login with my credentials. So let's go ahead and create this one. It's gonna be a property of a login view model. That's it. I would run this and let's see what happens. It should fail miserably. Right, it fails. So I'm expecting a login repository to be called, but the login repository is nowhere to be, it doesn't appear to be collaborating with the view model in any, anyhow. So I'm gonna, what I'm thinking of is actually inject the repository in the constructor of the view model. So how I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna do actually this one. I will make it a late init type login view model, and then I'm gonna initialize it here, and here I'm gonna inject the login repository, right? Okay, and then let's go ahead and add this parameter to the constructor. And I will make this one private value, and all I have to do here is just call the login repository with the credentials. Oops. Perform login credentials. just delegate the call. That's what is expected from this test. So if I run, let's see what happens. Yeah, I have a compilation error, and that's because in our acceptance test, I need to also provide login repository. Now, it's important to note here that in the acceptance test, I'm going to use real implementations, and I'm going to mock only the things that are really outside world and I cannot control, and I really need to mock. But other classes, which are going to be the real collaborators, I'm going to use real implementations. Whereas in the unit tests, I'm gonna try to mock those collaborators. So I'm gonna test the actual component in isolation. Okay, so here I'm gonna make this a late init login view model. So it's just gonna be a type of view model, and also I'll make here initialization block where I'm gonna be initializing this. And let's make a local variable for the repository. And here, as I said, I need an implementation rather than abstraction. So I'm gonna go ahead and say remote login repository. And that's gonna be a class that will also live in the login package. I'll move it on the other side. Right, and let's just implement the function exposed by the interface, but don't write any implementation. So I'm going to leave it as it is right now. I will just make it a bit bigger, but yeah. And now this one compiles, and if I get back to my to my view model tests, if I run, it should pass. Yay! So we're having our first test passed. If we get back to our requirements, it says that we should not perform login with invalid credentials. So sort of here we have to write a test. It should not perform login with invalid credentials. Right. So thinking about that, I could possibly add that validation inside the view model itself. But the question is, do I really want to do that? Here is how I am thinking about it. If I have to add, let's say, some sort of offline support or some caching, I would have to change the view model to add another collaborator for performing for working with a database or with other storage or whatever. So that's one reason why would I change the login view model. If I decide to change the the criteria for validating the username and password, I will have to change. That's going to be another reason for changing my login view model, and that's why I'm not gonna implement the validation inside the view model itself, but I'm rather gonna go ahead and introduce some sort of validator, which is gonna be collaborating in the view model. So here, I would expect, again, to verify that login repository never be called with my credentials, which is when I log in view model login. So when I call login with my credentials, I want my repository not to be called, but so it fails because it is being called. But I want to say here, given that some validator that validate my credentials will return false. Let's import this one, and the validator is going to be a mock at this point. I'm gonna make a late init var login credentials validator. Let's say it's gonna be a mock. Is this name quite right? Or maybe I can come up with, let's close this one. Maybe I can come up with something better. Okay, I'm just gonna use a credentials validator. I think that's gonna be fine. Let's go ahead and create an interface for it. I would put that into a validation package. Move it on the other side, make it a bit bigger. And yeah, so whenever I call validate for my credentials, I would expect a Boolean as a result. I don't have an implementation in my interface, right? So given validator validate will return false. Return false. When I call login, I would expect the repository not to be called. Right, but now this one is not. Now this one is not actually, the validator is not collaborating with my view model. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it as a dependency in my login view model. So validator, and I'll make it that way a collaborator. Okay, so it's not letting me add it automatically. I'm gonna go ahead and add it manually. So it's gonna be a credentials validator, and yeah, so here all I have to say is if validator validate credentials, then I'm gonna perform the login, and let's go ahead and run this test. Okay, again, we're having a compilation because we need to also supply the validator here. So I'm gonna also pass here validator and also create a local field for it, and it's gonna be a default or just login credentials validator. So that's gonna be a real implementation, so a real class, not the interface. I'm gonna extract it also inside the same validation package. Move it on the other side and make it bigger. All right, and now just gonna implement members, and yeah, I'm not gonna write any implementation at this point. Back to my view model, and here, oops, need my test, and I'm gonna run it. let's see what happens. It passes. However, I expect the other one to be broken because the mock by default will return false, and the login is not gonna work. So here I will have to say, given my validator dot validate credentials will return true, then calling login should actually call the repository. That's what I expect. Nice. So both tests are working. I think that this test is quite right, quite okay for now. And I think I have my view model covered. And let's take a look. Are these tests reflecting the behavior that is actually exposed by the view model? Let's say we are having a test that it should perform login. So we have the login function here. It takes the credentials, and here we say given validator validate credentials will return true. When we call login in the view model with those credentials, we expect the repository to be called. Do we have it here? So we say if the validator validate credentials, then login repository would perform login with those credentials. Great, it does reflect, and I think the level of abstractions that I'm having here in this function are not. It doesn't differ too much. And actually they are quite on the same level. All right, so how do we proceed further? We get back to our feature and we run the test and see. Yeah, so it tells us that we are having not implemented error, and it's actually in the login credentials validator being not implemented. Let's go ahead and write tests for it. So this would be should. Move it on the other side and make it bigger. So yeah, I would expect the validator to return true for given valid credentials. Well, 4 valid credentials is enough. And I'm gonna start with an assertion. Validator dot validate valid credentials, right? So what's the validator? Let's make it a property, and yeah, it's of type validator. So credentials validator, and it's the login credentials validator, right? Let's make an instance of it. And yeah, valid credentials. I'm gonna make it local here. Valid credentials are gonna be a login credentials like user and pass. And let's go ahead and run this. It will say not implemented, and I'll just return true here. And this test will pass, I hope. Yeah, and then go ahead and write another one, return false for invalid credentials. Yeah. So here I'm gonna do assert false validator validate invalid credentials. Yeah, so I'll also make a local login credentials and just pass empty strings. So login credentials which are sort of empty strings are not valid, and I would assume it to fail, right? So here I would say return with credentials. Let's make it smaller so you can see what we're doing. Username is not blank, and password is not blank. So it's not blank because make sure that it's not also a string with spaces. So yeah, here we go. If I run the whole suite, it's gonna, yeah, both tests are passing. I'm happy with it. And I'm happy also with the actual implementation. Seems clear to me. I'm gonna close this one, and I'm gonna close this one, get back to my login feature, and I'm gonna run and see what happens. Right. So now we're having another not implemented error for our repository. Let's go ahead and create a test for this one. It's gonna live in our tests. I'll move it on the other side, make it a bit bigger. It's too much. And here I'm gonna start with the test. So how this repository will work? So it should return successful result when login succeeds. Yeah, I got a typo here. Let's use yep. Right, so I would expect it to return the successful results, and I'm gonna start with an assertion. Perform login with given credentials. Let's make this smaller. Yeah, something like this. So what is success? Success gonna be, let's say, property. Yep, it's gonna be of, I'm just directly going to assign a login result the success logged in user. And what is logged in user? It's also going to be a property, and I'm directly going to assign a user imported username, full name, and about, let's say. Yeah, so that's going to be the success, the login repository. Let's create a property for it. It is our remote login repository, right? And I pass here the credentials, and the credentials are going to be also a property, and I'm directly going to assign sort of username and pass. Let's import this one. Oops. Let's import it. There we go. Yeah, so it says that this guy is not returning anything, right? So let's go back to our login repository and make it return login result. Make this smaller, right? And back here, we also have to make it return login result, so the override would work. And what do we have here now? Oops, assert equals, I need. Right. So is this clear enough? So assert equals success, login repository, that's what I expect. Login repository perform login with the credentials. Okay, so how this repository is going to actually perform the login. As we agreed at the very beginning, we were thinking about making a REST call. So we're going to contact some sort of REST API. And in that sense, we need to define that API. So I would say given login API dot login with the credentials will return logged in user. I'm gonna import it. Repository, yeah, result is, I'm gonna just move this one out to make it a bit cleaner, and I'm gonna assert. Yeah, so what is login API? Login API is actually something we're gonna mock here. That's external world. Anyway, we're writing at this moment the unit test, so we have to mock our collaborators, but also that's something that we're gonna mock in our acceptance test. So I'm gonna create a late init login API, and I'm gonna mock this guy, and because I'm having mock, I am going to use Mockito runner here. What is login API? Let's go ahead and create an interface for it. Also in the login package. Move it on the other side and make it a bit bigger. And here we are missing that function there. Let's create it. It takes credentials, it returns user. That's it. No implementation. Let's remove all that. Nice. Looks fine. Let's go ahead and run. And here I'll get back to my remote login repository. Yeah, not implemented, error. If I remove this, and yeah, so here as we can see, I'm not passing the login API anyhow in the repository. So let's go ahead and make this collaborator. So I'll start by making this a late init variable, and I'm gonna assign it in the init block, and here I'm gonna pass the login API, right? So let's add this in a constructor. I will make it private val. Yep. And here what I'm gonna do is just return the login API login with the credentials. No, I cannot return that, but val result, or rather login result, is, well, login user is login API.login, and I will return login result success with the logged in user. All right. Yeah, and now if I run this, I'm gonna get a compilation problem in the acceptance test. Let's go ahead and fix that one. So what is the login API? It's gonna be also a it's outside world, so I'm gonna just make this one a mock. And I'll move it up here. Yeah, it compiles, it's fine. So I'll get back to my initial test and run it and see. Right, so it passes. That's cool. So back to our problem definition. We need to also handle failures. So here I'm gonna write a test that says return failure result when login fails, right? And I'm gonna start with the assertion again. Failure, I would expect failure, and also I'm gonna make sure it's equal to the result. What is the result? The result is gonna be login repository perform login with credentials. And what is the failure? The failure, let's make it a property. It's gonna be a login result failure. Let's say valid credentials were incorrect. Something like that. I'll move it up here next to the success. So we are still not having this failure concept. Let's go ahead and create it. So I would also assume this to be a data class. It's gonna have val reason type string, and it's also going to be login result. And yeah, back to my repository. So, oh yeah, I forgot. No, it's fine. I'm not sure why it complains now. Oops. Yes, of course. Exactly. So, but here I would say now, given that login API the login with credentials will throw an HTTP exception. And here we have to pass also the response. So let's make sort of, oops. I'm gonna close this, make this a bit smaller. What's the response? Let's make it local variable is response.error. Let's say 401 and response body.create I don't know, null and empty string, whatever. Probably we need to supply here. Yeah, okay. And if I run this one, it's gonna fail. At least I expect it to fail because we're not handling that. right? And here in our remote login repository, we have to say here try, and then catch the HTTP exception. And in that case, we're gonna return login result dot failure. Yes, just the same string that we're expecting. And actually it warns us that we can lift the return up, and that's something that makes it a bit cleaner and nicer. Let's go ahead and run the test. Nice. And if I run both of them, I expect it to work. Great. Okay, back to our feature. If I now run, what's gonna happen? Right. So it says that we are specified non-null but it's null, and basically that's because we did not set up our mock here. We have to say the login API. So given, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna do that inside here. Given our login API, the login with the login credentials, will return success login result. Logged in user. That's what does it return. Yep. And if we execute this, yeah. So this order is not satisfied from our login view model. So what we have to do here is basically call the live data with login result loading, then do the same with the actual with the actual login result, and finally stop the loading. This is something that will satisfy this test at least. I hope so. Right, let's take a look here and make it a bit maybe nicer. Yeah. Now I think we can execute all the tests in the login package at once. Right, we have a failing test here, which says that again we're having I'm gonna close the left panel. Right, so the test is in the login view model. Here, it says that here we also need, because of the architecture components, we need to apply the same rule with the instant task executor. right? So if I run, it should work, right? And get back to our login package, run all the tests in here, everything should pass, right? Now we have the feature complete, and I think it's a nice time to make a commit here. Yeah, I think everything is already added. Right. Okay. So now we may think everything is fine, but there is one very important, actually the most important thing that we haven't done so far, and most probably you've noticed, which is actually the threading. Basically, if we attach this view model to any screen and if we call login, it's not going to work because by default it's going to be executed in the same thread where it is going to be called, which is the main thread, and this has to be an asynchronous operation. So how do we proceed? How do we fix that? I think what I'm thinking about is I'm going to start from the API working backwards. So I'm going to start by opening the API first, right? And here, instead of the user, I'm gonna wrap this into a deferred, which is actually the deferred comes from the coroutines package, which are no longer experimental in Kotlin 1.3 and up. And right now, if I get back to my if I get back to my feature, it says it's no longer working because it is not returning what it is supposed to return. So basically here, how I'm thinking to proceed is actually, because we wrapped the return object into a deferred, I'm gonna make this one to be logged in user response, and I'm gonna make a property out of it, which is going to be also a late init, deferred user. I'm gonna make it a mock, and I'll move it up here together with the other mocks. And I would say given login login API.login will return that response, and here I will also add given login response login logged in user response await will return the logged in user. Yeah, that should make it work. However, because I'm calling an await here, I need to make this I need to wrap this into a coroutine builder, which is something like run blocking that I can use here. Let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Most probably we're gonna have another compilation issue, but let's work step by step towards making everything work. Yep, and it says that right in the in our remote login repository we're having a problem. We are calling, yeah, this thing here no longer returns user, but it returns deferred user. So basically we have to call await here, And if we do so, we cannot in this function, because this is sort of something that has to be either something that has to be called either from a suspending function or from a coroutine builder. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and open the login repository and make this function suspending. All right, so I'm going to make it suspend function. Then get back to my repository. And here, the override doesn't work. Now it does. And that's gonna make this guy compile. Most probably I'll have to update the tests for remote login repository. If I get back here, and if I have it here, as expected, it does not compile. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same trick here. Instead of logged in user, it's gonna be logged in user response. I'm gonna make this a property, completely the same, deferred. I don't need it to be nullable. I'm gonna make it mock, and I'm gonna move it up together with the other mock, and I'm gonna say here given login user response await will return the logged in user. And this one also has to be wrapped into a run blocking, and it should make it. Here also we are missing a run blocking, and so here we have the response object given login API login will throw. I think for now everything looks fine. Let's go ahead and execute this one and see what happens. Most probably again we're gonna have a compilation issue, because from the view model we are calling the repository which has exactly. So the perform login is a suspending function and we are calling it from a normal function, so it's not gonna work. So I certainly need to wrap this into a coroutine builder, but I'm thinking about concept like providing some sort of interface where I'm gonna have foreground and background dispatchers, and I'm gonna have different implementation for the real production code and another for the tests, so I can easily manage that. So let's go ahead and wrap this into a launch, and I would expect something like dispatchers dot background. So I'm gonna have this one wrapped inside, and this one as well, and this one as well. Let's import. Well, I cannot. I need to actually make this view model extend a coroutine context, so I can get access there. But I'm thinking about moving that up one level, so I'm gonna have sort of a view model that I can extend around, and that's gonna take care about the job and the cancellation of the jobs. So basically here I'm gonna extend from something like coroutines view model or coroutine view model. It's a class that doesn't exist. I'm gonna create it. I'll put it into something like common, and this is gonna be a class that will extend from the view model, and it also will extend I'll make it a bit bigger. coroutine context, and I'll go ahead. Oh, sorry, I'm not gonna extend context, but coroutine scope. I need a scope here. And I'm gonna implement the members. So here I need something like dispatchers dot main UI. That's gonna be my default dispatcher. Plus I'm gonna add a job, and the job is gonna be a property that will be parent of all the coroutines that are going to be launched from the child view model. So every view model that's gonna extend from this one, whenever launches or does any other coroutine builder, essentially I'm gonna wrap the jobs, those jobs, child jobs, into this one, and I can cancel all of them at once when clear is being called. So I'll say job.cancel. So now what are these dispatchers? This is something that will be coming in the constructor. Let's make it private value dispatchers, and it's gonna be dispatchers, right? So let's, as we described before, let's make this one, and yeah, inside a common, it's gonna be an interface that will have UI dispatcher, and it's gonna have a background dispatcher. Oops. Yeah, I think that's fine. And then that's enough, I think. And then this one should be abstract, so I can extend it. I think this one is pretty much done. I am going to extend it here. Yeah. So now I'm able to construct new coroutines, actually. So now launch, I can launch new coroutines. What are the dispatchers now? So dispatchers also I'm gonna take here in the constructor. And I'll just provide it into my parent as well. And here it's gonna be something like, so in the background I'm gonna do the login, and then I'm gonna switch the context back here. So let's make this smaller. So I'm gonna say with context dispatchers the UI. So I'm gonna switch back to UI. I'm gonna perform actually the delivery of the results. This looks fine, but now I have to actually satisfy the tests too. So if I run this test, which is the well, any test, it will just say some compilation error. In the login feature and in the here I have to also provide dispatchers, and I'll make a local variable, and it's gonna be test coroutine dispatchers. This is something that doesn't exist yet. I'm gonna create a class into a separate file. I'm gonna make it also in the common, but it's gonna live in my tests instead. So it's not gonna be a production code. So let's implement the members both. I'll move it on the other side and make it a bit bigger. So here, what I essentially need is, because this is the tests, I'm gonna just use the default dispatcher for both for background and for UI. And that's gonna be enough for my tests. It's gonna work fine. And then if I go back to my feature test, I'm gonna run it. Most probably I'm missing one more place probably. That's the login view model. And here I'm also going to provide the same test dispatchers. Yeah, let's rename this one to dispatchers. In here, I'm gonna do wrap this into run blocking, and this one as well into a run blocking, because they're calling a function inside that is the perform login, which is suspending. And then I notice here that it highlights this one saying that the return type is not quite right. So what I have to do is just add here unit as well in the test below, and it should make it work. All right, now the compilation problems are gone, and most probably all the tests are also fixed. So if I get back to my feature test and execute it, let's see what happens. So it passes, and here I think we can do a little improvement. I'm gonna move this one up, then I'll move this one into a separate function, which is going to be called trigger login. I'm going to reformat a little bit the code, and I think that's going to make it a little bit cleaner. I'll run again the test just to make sure I didn't break it. So at this point, our login feature is completed, and that would wrap up our exercise on demonstrating the outside-in test-driven development on Android. I'm thankful for your time you spent watching this, and I really hope you'll find this valuable for you. Thanks again, and please share your feedback, and I'm gonna catch you in some of the next videos. Thanks.